Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're watching this webinar. Again, my name is Dave Nagel, very excited to share some information with my colleagues and friends in Fremont Unified School District, an overview of prioritization of standards for secondary teachers. This webinar focuses specifically on the literacy standards for history, science, and technical subjects, and how we must embrace that literacy is a shared responsibility. This is also a webinar that will focus specifically on some examples for history and social studies teachers. Let's go ahead and jump right in, shall we? Something I've mentioned during every webinar, our desire as teachers to make sure we can and teach everything we must, and teach it well, with the limited time constraints that we are faced with on a consistent basis. Hopefully you have your working handout for this particular webinar, we'll cover the last two webinars, webinars 3 and 4, specifically this one on literacy as a shared responsibility. Our success criteria for this webinar is that by the end of it, you'd be able to list some rationale for why literacy standards must be embedded across all disciplines. Determine some possible ways your department or course team can determine critical priority standards. And then for social studies teachers, an opportunity to dig into your standards that are, as much as anything, very content specific, and how you can determine how they need to be aligned with the literacy standards you would be teaching with them on a consistent basis. As I mentioned a moment ago, literacy is a shared responsibility, and what's one overwhelming statistic that is so connected to success in life is literacy and students' ability to be able to navigate complex text. And in many studies and many analysis, when students are aware of every socioeconomic status, every demographic factor, even special education and second language learners, the one constant that drove their achievement in learning was literacy. And so regardless of what their background is, literacy and being able to navigate, as I mentioned, through texts that they will encounter through their life, certainly at the secondary level and then into post-secondary education, but at any type of job training or anything else, and then also just being an educated citizen, they must have the ability to do that. So this is a great opportunity as a former science teacher myself, and we'll talk about social studies teachers today, how to use the literacy standards to go deep with our content. And it doesn't mean that we are teaching and assessing these at the same level we are our content standards if we are not a literacy or language arts teacher, but we're making sure they're the driver to help students engage and interact with and develop an understanding of the core content in our other disciplines. When we look at the Common Core state standards for language arts, ELA and literacy, and history, science, and technical subjects, what's powerful is they're designed in a way to augment the learning that will take place in these other areas. And again, if students are going to demonstrate to us their understanding of science or history or any technical subjects, they do so by reading and writing and speaking to us. So these literacy standards are really critical to help dig in. Have they really mastered the content that we're trying to make sure that they have through our priority standard teaching within our content areas? And I've just pulled up an example here for history and social studies 612. As we see here that the standards are written in a way that are similar to the language arts standards, but they really dig into some of our content areas. As we go through this process in Fremont, what will be important, and I'm going to show you at least one example from another district I worked with, that our language arts teachers will determine their literacy standards that might be the driver for the ones we would pick from then as non-language arts teachers, the ones that will develop well into our content areas. I want to stress for the math teachers that are in the room watching this webinar, across the country in some of the initial PARC and Smarter Balance assessment results, what is clearly critical, the highest failed math items have been the highest Lexile scores. So close reading and understanding how to dig into the material is critical. Students won't read the same amount of material in math, but they'll have to read with more precision when they're reading a math word problem. This is a district that I worked with in Missouri. And what they did, as you see here at the middle and high school level for science and social studies, foreign language, PE, practical arts, is they took their writing standards for this particular example and determined which of the 3 or 4 were the ones were going to be most critical for them as they were teaching their content. And as you see here, each one picked 3 or 4. What they did is they said these would be the standards when writing, for example, to help our students show and demonstrate the learning that they're doing in our classroom. So this is a place to remember as science or social studies, or of course, foreign language or any other subject matter teacher, math as well. What are the standards that students are going to use in literacy to demonstrate the learning in our content areas? And where these come from often are building off of the ones our literacy teachers had focused on, or language arts teachers. But again, it's determining which ones of these are the ones we're going to be very consistent with and using as supporting standards as much as anything with our content standards that we'll be teaching. So our first reflection question is, how do you currently embed literacy standards into your course of study? And then, do you currently assess them separately? Do you assess the writing separately from how they were determining whether or not what the mass of an object was? And then how might you align your standards with the ELA priority standards? Take a moment, pause the recording as long as you need, complete the reflection question, and any dialogue with your peers. Welcome back. As always, I assume that you've taken as much time as you need to pause the recording, and let's move on. Now, I'm going to walk us through a social studies example, and this will not take long, so I'm hoping everybody is watching it, even though it focuses on social studies. So I pulled a couple of 12th grade social studies standards from the California set of standards, and I happened to pull up grade 12. And I pulled two: evaluate the roles of polls, campaign advertising, and controversies over campaign funding, and describe the means that citizens use to participate in the political process. You see some examples there. With this particular example I'm going to walk us through, that was the priority standard possibly for this group. And then for students to be able to demonstrate that, they might have to write an argument that focuses on introducing a precise claim, distinguishing the claim from an opposing claim and a counterclaim. So they're taking that writing standard and really highlighting what's in yellow to have students demonstrate learning of those two priority standards that were determined for the social studies content. I'm going to walk us through one example that this particular set of teachers put together. They came up with these criteria. Students will have to analyze from multiple sources to make strong claims and arguments, and list and expand upon 1 to 2 possible counterpoints to their argument. And those are placed with asterisks because those are content skills that students are going to need in every subject matter. They're going to need to be able to do that consistently, and so they're going to be revisited in multiple units. And then you see the other ones: how citizens vote based on political party affiliation, identifying beliefs or constituent groups, and indicate specific examples of how those constituent groups' beliefs drive their actions and behaviors by default, in this particular example, with voting. So they came up with a shorter constructed response item, aligned to both the social studies priority standard and the literacy standard. Write 1 to 2 paragraphs explaining how beliefs may have affected political parties, interest groups, funding, and the mass media in the primary election. Another point I wanted to mention here is what you see there in the achieve success criteria. So why this is so important is it will drive how we're designing our assessment items, but then far too often we will be collecting evidence from students on things that aren't aligned to the priority standards. And then when we create scoring guides or rubrics, we sometimes over-rubricize them. We come up with criteria for what it would look like if it was progressing, or my son will come home sometimes with a description of what his work would look like if it was absolutely a train wreck. Here, you see an alignment between the achieving the success criteria and what is written in the constructive response directions. Then anything less than that is simply progressing or emergent. This is a piece that comes into play when we dig into the common formative assessment design. So I'm kind of highlighting a couple of points here with an emphasis on social studies, but all of us can have a takeaway from that. Do our priority standards aligned to our tasks and assignments? And then are they aligned into the scoring guides? And then here, deeply embedded the literacy standard for students to be able to meet the social studies standard. I'm going to dig into one more example from these same two standards. After analyzing your sources, demonstrate your understanding of the influence of political parties, interest groups, mass media on constituent beliefs and their voting behaviors. In a 3 to 5 paragraph essay, develop and defend a claim of which the 3 has the most power over political outcomes. Then students have to include this in their essay, develop a strong argument, formulate a clear, concise thesis, support claims with textual evidence, directly back to those literacy priority standards that I demonstrated a moment ago. Identify the powers of the influence identified and limitations on that influence over political voting elements. State 2 to 3 counterpoints of your claim. Again, leverage a piece of the standard that's going to connect across all disciplines. When students are putting counterpoints to their claim in social studies, they do the same thing in English, in math, in science, and other places. Include a prediction and rationale for the general election, which is forthcoming before this assignment was given to the students, and include a terse conclusion statement that aligns well to your overall thesis. Then here, this is where you might want to pause the recording for a moment if you want to look at this in more detail. I won't speak to every piece to it. But again, what we see here is the power and importance of determining our priority standards, for this particular example, social studies content, that directly align with the literacy standards. Students can't determine how voting powers and voting habits take place and demonstrate to us without having some element of literacy, particularly the claims and counterclaims, embedded in their responses. So you see here again, we have the achieves criteria, something for the exceed, and anything less is simply not meeting that criteria. That's just another element that I added in. But I think you can see the power and importance of determining, certainly as social studies teachers, what standards are essential for in our curriculum from one course to the next. So we're hitting certain elements and making sure we can build upon student understanding, but embedded with that, the literacy standards that students will use to demonstrate that understanding. So a reflection question specific to social studies teachers, but all of us can kind of look at this from our own lens. How do you currently determine priority standards for your content area? And then for all of us, how might we consider to embed the Common Core literacy standards as a primary focus related to your units of study? And that's for the rest of us that are involved in this webinar. Please take a moment, pause the recording as long as you need to, and complete this final reflection question. Welcome back. As always, I assume you've had time to pause the recording, and I'll move on, and you pause as long as need be. Excuse me. So, wrapping this section up. By the end of this webinar, hopefully you've been able to understand the rationale why the literacy standards must be embedded across disciplines, and how we can connect them back to what our literacy teachers come up with. Determine possible ways for our department or course team to determine those priority literacy standards. And then for social studies specifically, because we didn't have a separate one for you with as much content specifics that are embedded in your social studies standards, the same thing applies in terms of your rationale. Readiness will be a key element, along with leverage as you're determining those. What's the criteria you're using for determining priority standard for your subject matter that could be aligned with the literacy standards? As always, anytime you have questions, thoughts at all, please shoot me an email at dave.nagel@corwinlearning.net. As I've mentioned every time, I'd be more than happy to engage in a deeper dialogue over the phone, or if you had time to your PLC meeting and you wanted to schedule a webinar, I'd be more than happy to help anytime. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks so much as always for your attention. Have a great day, and we'll see you on the next webinar.